listener production.
Hey, Benzion Siebert here with The Briefing. Pretty much everyone was surprised by the results of France's general election at the weekend. French voters turned their back on the country's far right, despite expectations Marine Le Pen and her National Rally Party would win big. Instead, a hastily assembled group of France's left-wing parties is projected to win the second round of a parliamentary election. The reaction to the results in France has been, let's say, mixed.
Il est 20h et on découvre la nouvelle assemblée et ce n'est pas le tiers.
That was the sound of people celebrating the surprise left-wing victory. But there were also riots in the streets of Paris, with reports of protesters throwing Molotov cocktails, lighting bonfires and clashing with police in riot gear, who dispersed them with tear gas. So what does this result mean for the future of the country and for its centrist president, Emmanuel Macron, as well as his far-right nemesis, Marine Le Pen? Well, to find out, I'm joined by Dr Romain Fathi. He's an award-winning cultural historian with the Australian National University and an expert in French politics and history. He joins us now from Paris. Romain, thanks so much for joining us. Some of us got whiplash watching the twists and turns of this election. Were you surprised by the result?
Look, I think everybody was. I mean, in a way, I'm surprised and not surprised. I'm surprised because what was announced was National Rally, the far right first, and then perhaps the left second and Macron third. And what came out was the left first, Macron second, and the far right third. So that was quite unexpected. But in a way, I'm not surprised because that is kind of consistent with what we call the Republican front, in the sense that in every electorate, people band up together against the National Rally, which makes it very hard for them to win. So great sense of relief from myself and from most of the French, but a great sense of surprise as well.
There's two elections, so to speak. There's one week and one another week. Do you think that people saw the results of the first election, which saw some pretty strong success from the far right, and they thought, well, we got to do something about this, and that was part of the reason for the opposite result the next week?
Your understanding is not too far off reality, but with the first and second round, participation was actually really high. About 67-68% of the French voters. I know in Australia you've got compulsory voting. France doesn't. In Australia you also have preferential voting. France doesn't. We have a two-round winner-takes-it-all system. So in the first round, you vote for whoever takes your fancy, somewhere between sometimes 12 to 20 different candidates. But in the second round, you can only vote for the people who got more than 12.5% of registered voters in the electorate. Usually, that's two people. It can be three or four. And in this specific instance, where there's been three or four candidates to choose from at the second round, people who were not from the far right chose the person who was the best placed to win against the far right. So instead of having two or three candidates, it was one candidate for the moderate left, the moderate right, and the moderate centre against the National Rally. So even though paradoxically they are the party, the far right, the National Rally, that got the most unique votes, like single votes in the election, they did not win.
So what do you think the future now holds for the far right National Rally leader Marine Le Pen?
Now, that's a very good question, because even though they came third and everybody is like, well, you know, victory for the left, it's okay for Macron and it's a defeat for the far right, actually, they are moving from 89 MPs to 143. So they're becoming stronger. Yes, they don't have a majority. Yes, they won't be able to rule. But in 2007, they had 0 MP in the House. In 2022, 89, and now 143. So we can see a rise of the National Rally, which is kind of consistent with Marine Le Pen's strategy to open up the party. The National Rally is the heir, quite literally, of the National Front, which was Marine Le Pen's dad party. I mean, this guy has been convicted for denying the Holocaust. Some of his friends were known Nazis, and it's not a figure of speech. They are from that generation. So the National Front used to be a very racist, anti-gender diversity movement, etc., etc. The National Rally of Marine Le Pen has put these issues slightly on the side to turn from racist party into a populist party. So the party has evolved, meaning that it's been able to attract more voters, retirees, workers who move from the left to the far right to protect their jobs. Well, allegedly, and the youth as well, because Marine Le Pen's second in command, Jordan Bardella, has been extremely active and very successful in social media, mobilizing the youth.
So what can you tell us about the left-wing alliance that was cobbled together pretty quickly in order to have this exact result?
One of the issues of the left throughout the world and democracies is that it generally struggles to unite itself. And so you've got a strong feeling of support for the left from the people, but maybe 10 or 15 different parties running. And that's been a case in France for many years, and that has costed the left a few elections. After the 9th of June, they realized that if they were going to run separately as different parties, they would stand no chance. So they worked together from the communist, from the far left, the center left, the green, the moderate left. Everybody worked together to create what is called the New Popular Front. And it's a 3-week-old alliance that has done surprisingly well because it has just come first, getting 182 MPs in the House out of 577. Now, clearly, they won't be able to rule on their own because to have a majority, you need at least 289 MPs. But they're coming first, meaning that whoever Macron appoints as the next prime minister will probably have to come from the moderate left.
What do you think we can expect in terms of large-scale policy from this new governing coalition?
At the moment, it's very unclear because one of the key leaders of this new alliance is called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and he's a very divisive political figure. And yesterday, he came out first, as soon as the elections result came out, to kind of claim the victory for the coalition. And that's a bit fraught because there are many faces to that coalition. He said that his party, La France Insoumise, would make sure that the New Popular Front would apply the electoral promises that they've made, among which raising minimum wage and also returning to the previous preservation age for pensions. It's currently sitting at 64, 65, and they want to take it back to 62.
What does all this mean for Emmanuel Macron?
It is clearly a loss of power for him. In France, the president is all-powerful when they've got a clear majority of their own party in the National Assembly. That is not going to be the case for Emmanuel Macron anymore. He was already having to face a minority government situation, and that's why he dissolved the lower house to see whether he could get something better happening. That didn't work out. So now Emmanuel Macron will be in a situation where he will have to listen a lot more to the new coalition that will emerge to form a majority, and that coalition will be able to suggest a government to the president, because at the end of the day, it's the president who appoints the prime minister. Now, if I translate that into the Australian political system, your head of state is the Governor-General. And although they're invested with a lot of constitutional power, the Governor-General is barely someone you hear about in everyday life in Australia. In France, the head of state is the president. And you hear about the president a lot because they have a lot of constitutional powers vested into the presidentship that they apply. The prime minister is just the first of the minister. In Australia, the prime minister is the head of the government, and that's a person that you see on media. So what will happen for Emmanuel Macron is that he's likely to work with a prime minister who will come from the left because that's the most elected party in the new House, but who is not likely to come from his own party. So he's going to lose a little bit of his power, knowing that for foreign policy, for instance, that's usually the prerogative of the French president rather than the prime minister. What this means for the French-Australian relationship at the moment, I believe that not much will change.
Just finally, you mentioned the kind of startling growth of the far right over the past decade or so. Do you expect that to continue into the future, and why? What's happening in France that you think might be driving this?
That's an excellent question, and it really is the million-dollar question, because at the moment, even though the National Rally came first, there is a clear trajectory in the last 15 years, like a wave that nobody seems to be able to fight. So the election that everybody is watching is 2027, because that's the next presidential election. No one can remove Emmanuel Macron from his presidency job at the moment, unless he becomes clinically insane, which is unlikely, or chooses to resign, which is less likely, but not totally unrealistic. He is likely to stay the president until 2027. And so Marine Le Pen is definitely gearing up and working for that next election, because they've been able, at the National Rally, her party, to increase their electorate. And if we find ourselves in a situation where in 2027 we've got a far-right president in France, followed by the election of a far-right National Assembly, then God help us, because there will be no institutional framework to prevent them from applying a hardline, far-right set of policies.
Thanks so much for joining us today on The Briefing.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Dr Romain Fathi there. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. But before you go, s'il vous plaît, we would love it if you could share this episode with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. That's LISTNR Newsroom. I'm Ben Sion Siebert. Catch you next time.